Welcome to the episode of Safe Space, the podcast for next generation family business leaders. Today we're joined by Brandi Harleaux out of Houston, Texas. Brandi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show, Franco. I'm glad to be here.
So, we were chatting before we started recording, and you were sharing, a little bit about your journey, and it's an unusual journey into typically a very male dominated business, the recycling business, right?
Right.
So, can you maybe introduce yourself, a little bit about you, your journey, then how you got into the business, and then we'll get into the meat of the show.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. Again, it's a pleasure. It is absolutely a pleasure, and I have the pleasure of running and leading a metal recycling and sustainability company. As you mentioned, we're headquartered out of Houston. It's called South Coast Oak Recycling Center, and this business started over 31 years ago. It started over 31 years ago by my mom and dad. My dad was an aluminum buyer at that time, and this was a part of his vision, which we can unpackage a little bit later. But we have focused on recycling and paying for the value of metal from not only households and residences, but we've since grown into a business to business service model whereby we service oil and gas, manufacturing companies, utility companies, and even government entities. And so I enjoy leading a team that gets to focus on what I call a triple bottom line. We get to focus on people, planet, and profit. I've been here going on 13 years. I came in as the chief operations officer, kind of bringing my business background to the family business and moved into the role of CEO during COVID. During COVID, my dad exited stage right, or what I'd say took the train and he said, I'm out. And I just have the pleasure of leading a phenomenal team and servicing our customers and the community and just love every bit of it.
So let's talk about your journey, right? You talk about, pixie dust to rust dust.
Hmm.
Share your journey, that you took from school, the corporate world, and then the family business. And what were the learnings along this way that you would apply to the family business?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I started my journey. I think a lot of folks that have an option or opportunity to go into family business don't necessarily pursue it early on. And I tell people oftentimes it's not typically your kids' vision or passion what parents had. And so I was no exception to that. I went to undergrad at the University of Houston. I had a strong interest in psychology and business. I've always thought that the intersecting of those two went really well together. Left the University of Houston, moved to Southern California to go get a master's degree in industrial organizational psychology. Um, Again, still focused on, okay, how do I do psychology and business in the corporate space, whether that be change management, whether that be working on mergers and acquisitions, whether that be succession planning. So I pursued that path, finished grad school, ended up getting a great opportunity at Northrop Grumman in aerospace, kind of working in the leadership development, talent management, training and development space. But even while I was doing that, I think like a lot of folks, there's this sexy company that you want to go work for. And I remember living in Southern California, and I would drive through Burbank, California at that time, and it still is, I think, where the Walt Disney Company corporate office was. And there was a building with a Mickey on the side, and this was before our cameras were what they are today. And I remember pulling over and I took a picture of the building and I said, I'm going to work there one day. And so we'll rewind again. I ended up getting my first opportunity at Northrop Grumman, had a great boss there. While I was there, I joined a trade association kind of for training and development and organizational development folks. I actually did that while I was in grad school. So I would drive into LA to go network, knowing that I was going to eventually kind of be working my way from the Inland Empire, Rancho Cucamonga specifically. And so God was at the Northrop Grumman. kept networking while I was there, loved it, had a great boss, got a call about 2 years into that opportunity from some folks I had networked with at Disney, and they said, "We think your dream job became available." So they had an opportunity in a department called GLOD, Global Leadership and Organizational Development. Fast forward, I ended up taking that opportunity. I left Northrop Grumman, which was a great company, and ended up going to work for the Walt Disney Company. And it was there, I probably spent about 8 years where I worked again on mergers and acquisitions. I led leadership development programs. I worked with the C suite to put together coaching plans for them, work on succession planning. And while I was there, Franco, and I think this happens to most of us at different junctures in life, where someone could either plant a seed or someone waters a seed that was already planted. And for me, it was the latter. One of our coaches, his name was Peter, he would work with the C suite that I would set up some coaching engagements with. And we would normally do these debriefs after the coaching engagements. And I'm following typical protocol to sit down with him to talk about what's next, for the executive that he's working with. And he said, "Hey, Brainy, I actually want to talk about you." And that conversation then led to him saying, "You're doing a great job here, but what's next for you?" And when sometimes people ask you what's next and you think you're sitting in your next, you're like, this is what's next. I'm looking around. I'm like, this is a nice company. It's a great company, cushy office, it's great benefits. And it was then that he said, "Hey, have you thought about really what's next?" And Franco, I thought, okay, you know what? I've always thought about working for a big five consultant firm. Maybe I'll go do that, do organizational development and strategy in that space. I've always had this entrepreneurial bug, probably because I watched it. And so I thought, you know what? I think it'd be pretty cool to own some franchises. And so I was talking with Peter through that. And finally, Peter says, "What about this family business that you've told me about in Houston?" And I looked at him sideways and I said, "The scrap metal business?" And he smiled at me and he said, "Yes, Brandy." And it was then that I just kind of paused and I was like, "Really?" And so he then proceeded to paint a picture of Franco. He said, Brandy, I really think recycling is the way of the future." Mind you, this is like 2009, 2010, and I'm living in Los Angeles at that time. And I'm like, yeah, I can see that. And then he goes on to say, and there's not a lot of people that can take over a family business from one generation to the next. And not only can they not do it, he said, but typically they're doing it because somebody has passed away or the business is fledgling. And I think, okay, good point. And then he said, he looks at me and he said, "Brainy, I bet there's not many people like you that have gone from a Fortune 100 company into a small mid-market family business, and can take the skills that you've acquired over that period of time and grow it and be successful." And it was that last piece that I was just like, yeah, that's a really good point. And so that wasn't an overnight decision. That really led to kind of a lot of conversations with other mentors. It led to conversations with my parents. Hey, what do you guys think about this? It led to a lot of prayer. It led to conversations with my husband because it would completely change kind of our life. And kind of landing that plane, where I landed, after a lot of conversation was that this is something that I wanted to do. And I really felt like if I was going to work this hard for the mouse, because I really gave things my all, then I was going to go work this hard for my family and a family business whereby we can generate more family wealth. We could have a broader impact, on people in our community. And then that led me to really start down a path of preparing for that transition. And again, that was 15 years ago, and I have not looked back.
So let's talk about, the early years. Like,
Mhm.
there must have been a lot of challenges, doubts, you know, not just from you, but from your dad.
Yeah,
How did you guys manage that? How did you manage those family dynamics
yeah.
while at the same time operating a business and maintaining the father daughter relationship?
That is such a good question. I would say for us, and this is not everybody's fabric, some of that preparation started before I even joined the family business. Because one of the things that I did, and not that it's required, but once I made the decision that I was going to transition, leave corporate America, come to the family business, I actually decided to go back to school. And I ended up going and attending a fully employed MBA program at Pepperdine. So I worked full time at the Walt Disney Company, and then I went to school for 2 years at night, kind of in an MBA program, because I really felt like I was not going to catch up to the years of experience that my dad had in the industry. And I had talked to a lot of people who were in family businesses, and some, the perception being they were riding on coattails, others, they didn't have experience outside of the family business. And I really wanted to bring a unique perspective. And so for me, that preparation started while I was in business school. In business school, we would have to obviously different projects, whether that be run a company valuation, understand the P&L statement, work on a forecast, understand what type of assets you can invest in. Does it make sense to divest? And for me, it was a case study on South Post Oak Recycling Center. Every project that I had, I did it on my family business for those 2 years. And so
So cool
it gave
and
me
smart.
yeah,
Very
it
true.
gave me a 2-year runway to have these conversations with my dad, 2 years prior to joining. It's just kind of like, "Why is this structured this way? Help me understand the supply chain, who the end consumer is, why are we going to these markets?" And so that was one thing that I think helped, with the transition. Not that it was perfect, but it was one thing that helped. Something else is, that same coach that I told you about that kind of watered the seed also was the same person that says, "Hey, one thing I want you to always remember is that your dad-daughter or father-daughter relationship should never be kind of sacrificed, if you will, even in business." And so I understood that. I understood that, and I would say the third lesson that helped, and I gathered it probably within 2 years of being in the business, is I went to UCLA. They had a family business certificate program, and I never this professor talked about this model, and he talked about this model of big B versus little b. And he pretty much said, family businesses either fail or succeed based on this model. He said, and so, I'm sorry, big B, little b, big F, little f. So he said, so business represents the family. I mean, business represents business. F represents the family. He said those family businesses that constantly have tension and they kind of go off the rails operate off of a big F, little b framework. It's like family first in the business, business second, right? He said those that succeed in the context of a business. We're not talking about once you go home for Thanksgiving, et cetera. It's like the business entity, the for-profit entity. He said they said they operate off of a big B, little f model. Business first. Our decisions are made based on the business. What drives it? Recognizing that it is likely the business that feeds the family, or the extended family or the community. And so then you have a little f mentality in that. So I would say those three things, taking that to the business when I joined, also pre conversations about our risk tolerance. We had, before I even joined, there were conversations, like some candid and frank conversations about kind of my dad's aspirations, in terms of growth, what growth looked like and what it didn't look like. And so we had some agreements early on, before I entered, that pretty much said, I'm not making this leap just to maintain what you have successfully built. I am maintaining this so that we can grow it.
So what I'm hearing is a couple things. First of all, you took the initiative to understand the business,
Yep.
at a deep dive without being involved in it. So you were removed, so a deep dive. So you're able to
Yes.
study it and understand it. The other thing that I heard was really prioritize, the father-daughter relationship above all,
Yep.
right? And then at the same time, understood that business is the priority and not family in the business.
Yes. You
So
got it.
there were some real priorities that were taken. Now let's talk about um, So you did that, and then your dad exited over COVID.
Yep.
How was that transition? How did you both manage it? Because the one thing that families struggle with, family business, is how do we know the next generation is prepared
Right.
to step into that leadership and ownership role? So
Yeah.
how did you guys know that you were prepared, first of all, to take over and receive? And how was he prepared to let go?
Yeah. You know, we dealt with both sides of this coin. And I will admittedly say it was not um the most orderly transition. It was almost out of necessity. um so a couple of things. I think when I came in to the business in 2013, and I know that this is not everybody's experience, I think, but there was an underlining trust or confidence that my dad had in me as a business person, as a business woman. And I think that helped. I think early on, he did question. He's like, "Can she learn this business? Can she learn the business?" The metal recycling industry seems very simplistic on the surface, but it has a lot of elements underneath it, from trading material to the supply chain to who your customers are to regulatory implications. So I say that because very early on, he literally is like, "Okay, Brandy, you're here. Let's get you up to speed so that I can exit stage right." And I do realize a lot of people aren't dealing with that. And so if anything, our conversation was early on, well, wait a second, we need to have a proper transition. I really want to make sure that I'm set up for success, so that we can do this the right way. Um, there was not that power struggle, if you will, early on,
Mhm.
in terms of, I own this. I would never want to leave it. So I think that that helped. If anything, our differences along what I found early on were around how we handled people. How we handled people. I would call it kind of one generation's form of handling people and another generation's form of handling people. The other thing that I would think is just kind of this level of amplifying our professionalism. Um, my dad definitely is a finance guy. He's an operations guy, very orderly, but there were not necessarily formal processes and systems in place. There was all of this tacit knowledge, and it was kind of him as the chief and, all 40 Indians. And so over time it had to be like, yes, no, I don't want to lead from a place of, everything stops with me. And so I think that that became a interesting transition point. And to your point around succession, I tried to create order early on. I was like, okay, let's bring an attorney in that can help us structure kind of what a transition looks like. Let's bring in an investment person. Let's talk about what that looks like. Let's have, our CFO at the table, right? Let's just create a whole project team. And I want to be real for people. I mean, my parents are not very receptive to that early on. And I think a lot of private businesses, understandably so, are very protective of their assets, of
Sure.
their financials. And so this wasn't like a bulldozing, but I tried probably for about 5 years, honestly, Franco, to kind of assemble resources and subject matter experts. And we would take a couple steps forward, and then it wouldn't go anywhere. Fast forward to COVID, and I say I know it was a tumultuous time for many. There were a lot of silver linings in COVID for me, and hopefully others found some as well. And there were some hard lessons, but one of them for us was my dad not coming back after COVID. COVID hit. I think, understandably, for a lot of entrepreneurs who kind of rode out cycles in business or industry, they can be pretty exhausting, to overcome another
Mhm.
tranche, whether that be 5, 8 years in. And I think you asked, how did he build the confidence? This was an inorganic way to do it. It was literally, by the time COVID hit, I had been 8 years into the business. He was like, "Okay, you got it. You got it. I'm not coming back. You can take it from here." And so, like I said, it was not a formal transition. And as I land that question, that really came at a time where it was like I was running 3 trains at the same time. And one train was, "Okay, let's get my dad off of the train," so that I could kinda transition out. The other is, "Let's survive today because we still don't know what's quite going on with COVID."
Right.
And then there was a third train because there was still this belief in me that this too shall pass, not even understanding the magnitude of COVID, but there was this future focused train. It was just like, we gotta survive today, but we're gonna look forward to the future as well. So it was all those 3 train tracks while we kinda got them off to transition.
So let's talk about, obviously you've been successful as a woman in a male dominated industry.
Mhm.
So for the listeners, if you could talk about what does it take to be a successful leader um, in a male dominated industry.
Yeah.
It's got to be harder than most.
Yeah.
There's some definite challenges that are there,
Yeah.
and how do you overcome those without being too soft and too hard? How
Yeah.
do you manage that balance?
I think a lot of it is a give and take. But if I just think about kind of my journey, I think one element of overcoming, but also leaning into it is to be good, to be good at what you do, to strive for excellence. I worked really hard early on to understand this business, understand the supply chains, understand who our customers are, what our diversification was, but even so, the reality is that oftentimes in a male-dominated world, where competence is often the statement that needs to happen, that is not enough. It is not enough. And that could either go move toward a space of intimidation. She thinks she knows it all, or you got to know more. You don't know X, and so I think but I still think it's necessary to be competent, and to know what you don't know, or be open, being coachable. The second that I really think is important for anybody who is not the majority in a situation is to have champions or advocates. Have champions or advocates. And I had several of them. I mean, one of which was my dad. And I do know in many multi-generational businesses that is not the same through line. Some people are literally fighting with their parents or the gen over power and control and decision making. And I'll tell you, Franco, early on, we would be at meetings or trade shows, and people would blatantly look directly at him, asked him a question about buying or selling material. He had already stated that, hey, Brandy is taking over the business. She's going to be managing this function. And then the same thing, they would look directly at him. And I don't even know if he was conscious of it, but he would say right back to them, hey, I just said Brandy's going to be taking over this function and you could talk to her about it. And that was a game changer. It seemed so subtle, but he constantly redirected people, which then allowed me to kind of step into it, gave me
Yeah,
increased
yeah. He
confidence.
he 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 intentionally supported you in front of others.
Exactly.
Like he
E
he said, you know what? He gave you the power.
Yes, he did. He did, and I don't know if everybody realizes how important that is. I think hugely for multi-generational businesses. I've attended a lot of next gen programs, and I've sat at these conferences that are always good. But when I talk to my peers that are second or third gen, I would say 8 times out of 10, folks are struggling with being either affirmed, being supported, to make decisions. And I think it's a huge roadblock, especially as the more senior, for understandable reasons, think, hey, I'm not sure if they're ready. Part of that might also be affirming them, or affirming them or supporting them.
I think that's a great piece, Brandon. I like just the audience really pay attention to this, particularly if you're a senior generation member, the importance
Yeah.
of affirming and supporting your next generation in front of others.
Yes.
That's
That
the
was
key,
huge.
right?
Yeah. It was very huge. And it still happens. It still happens today. When my dad pops out sometimes and comes with me to a trade show event and folks are talking about the industry, it still happens. And so I would encourage that. So I mentioned kind of excellence and being good at what you do as a way to navigate. The second is champions. Like I said, there were other men and women in the industry that kind of took me early on and say, hey, from let's talk about the industry, let's talk about navigating roadblocks. I think that helped. The third thing that I think really helped me was getting involved in my industry trade association very early on. And it did several things. It allowed me to continue to learn and grow. It allowed me to meet the players. It allowed me to build
Mhm.
relationships that were in a male dominated industry, but allowed me to even observe how relationships were being built, how deals were being done, so that I could then navigate a bit differently. And so those were some things that I think early on for me, and even still today, um, helped. Uh, the bonus, I think, on top was as I kind of took on board positions in my trade association and beyond, I realized one of the execs or the leaders said at some point, "Hey, Brandy, board members," he said, "How do we go about seeing more women at our board meetings?" And
Nice.
I said, "Are you serious?" He said, "Yes." I said, "I think that that's an easy answer." I said, "I think invite them, to the table. I think include them, in your dinners and your conversations and not just have the boys at dinner. I think also create a space where where they can move into leadership roles." And that conversation was probably in 2017, Franco. And soon after that, I proposed that we form a women in recycling or group, not to be a sorority, but to really be a place of community, promote leadership opportunities, and so forth. And I would tell you that the board meetings this year went from like a couple of women in a room of 90 to, a good third, 25 to 30% of the room being
That's awesome.
women. And that was very intentional.
That's so cool. So we're coming to the top of the show as I knew we would. So I always like to ask our guests the same question, So from your experience and your journey, what's one piece of advice you can offer the current or the senior generation, and what's piece of advice you can offer the next generation?
Yeah. I think the piece of advice that I would say is value open conversation and dialogue. Create a space where the senior generation can share what their vision was or is, share uh, what they've gone through to get to where they are, and share also where they would like to see it go. And I think creating the same space for the less senior generation to answer those same questions. And then from there, I think it's important to look and say, where's common ground? Where's common ground? Or where is there give and take? But I don't think that those conversations happen as candidly and intentionally as they should. And I think it can open the door to realize and for there to be appreciation on both sides, whereby creating a space for duality and duality is important because I realized that I was not interested in getting rid of everything that my dad had implemented or built or that was foundational. I was going to take a lot and most of those elements and then add further innovation on top of it, add further processes on top of it. And so that's what I would say is create that space for conversations where you can truly share your vision, you can share the history, and you can share your desire for future advancement and growth.
Right, that's a wonderful piece of advice. So if people wanted to reach out, learn more about you, and just chat with you, how do they find you?
Yeah, absolutely. A couple things. Well, I guess personally, I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me Brandi Harleaux. I think from a company standpoint, you can always go to southpostoakrecycling.com. And then there's always just email. You can email me Brandy at southpostoakrecycling.com. And I'd be happy to connect.
Brandy, thank you so much for being on the show. Real honor, great insights, great journey. Thanks for your generosity and sharing.
Thank,
Really appreciate it.
thank you, Franco, and thanks for sharing the stories. I know that they're very helpful.
So, folks, there you go. Another great story. Brandy openly shared what worked, some key nuggets here. So, pay attention. And as you know, this show is for you because we recognize it's a lonely place to be next gen of a family business. And what's most important is that you share, share the wisdom, share the knowledge, share the conversation with your peers. So, until next time, Brandy, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Franco. It's my pleasure.